Manfred Peris was a German paratrooper sent behind enemy lines during World War II. Disguised in American uniforms, he and two comrades carried out sabotage missions during the Battle of the Bulge, aiming to confuse Allied troops and disrupt their supply lines. All three were captured by U.S. forces and tried as spies, a charge that meant certain death. On December 23, 1944, Peris and his fellow soldiers faced a firing squad. Witnesses recalled that he remained calm to the end, accepting his fate without fear. But what do you think? Was this execution justice or vengeance? Martin Gottfried Weiss, known as the Demon of Dachau, was executed by hanging on May 29, 1946, at Landsberg prison. Weiss served as commandant in several Nazi concentration camps: Neuengamme from 1940 to 42, Majdanek in 1943 to 44, and finally Dachau in 1945, where he assumed control just before Germany's defeat. Witnesses and camp records exposed his involvement in mass executions, forced labor, and the atrocious conditions in the camps. After his arrest in Munich in April 1945, Weiss was tried in the Dachau main trial beginning November 1945. He was convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity, for his role in the terror of the camps, and for supervising special euthanasia-style killings. Shortly before his execution, he cried out, "I am dying for Germany." This old man, Johannes Oper, was executed in 1945 for his role in the Rüsselsheim massacre. In August 1944, after an American bombing raid, captured U.S. airmen were marched through the town. Oper and other civilians joined a mob that beat the defenseless pilots to death with stones and clubs. Tried by a U.S. military tribunal, Oper was found guilty of war crimes. On November 10, 1945, he was hanged at Bruxelles prison, one of 6 civilians executed for the brutal killings. In April 1945, as the war in Europe neared its end, German spy Richard Jarczyk was captured by U.S. forces in Kitzingen, Germany. Disguised in civilian clothes, he had crossed Allied lines, gathering intelligence and carrying out sabotage behind the front. His arrest led to a swift military tribunal. Witnesses testified that Jarczyk's actions endangered American soldiers and violated the laws of war. The court found him guilty of espionage, a crime punishable by death. At dawn, Jarczyk was led to an open athletic field. Bound to a wooden post, his eyes blindfolded, he stood silently as a priest offered a final prayer. Moments later, an American firing squad took aim. The order was given. A sharp volley of rifles echoed across the field, and Richard Jarczyk collapsed lifeless at the post. His execution was among the last carried out in wartime Germany. Wilhelm Dietermann, a German civilian tried for war crimes, was executed by hanging on January 10, 1946, at Bruxelles prison. Dietermann had taken part in the brutal killing of captured American airmen during the final months of the war. Witnesses described how downed pilots, defenseless and in custody, were beaten and murdered by enraged civilians. Among them, Dietermann was identified as one of the leading attackers. After Germany's surrender, he was brought before a U.S. military tribunal. The evidence was overwhelming, and the court found him guilty of violating the laws of war. His plea that he was carried away by the crowd failed to convince the judges. On that cold January morning in 1946, before U.S. guards and officials, Dietermann was led to the gallows at Bruxelles. Moments later, the trap was released, and justice was delivered for the murdered airmen. This man, Wilhelm Tempel, was an SS guard who served in Dachau's Kaufering subcamps. Survivors remembered his brutality, beatings, forced labor, and executions carried out under his watch. At the Dachau trials, witnesses described how Tempel personally struck prisoners and even took part in lethal shootings. He admitted in court, "I became anti-Semitic. It is a good thing I'm being executed. I would have killed thousands of Jews." On May 29, 1946, at Landsberg prison, Wilhelm Tempel was hanged for war crimes and crimes against humanity. On December 23, 1944, 3 German soldiers, Sergeant Manfred Peris, Lieutenant Gunther Billing, and Private Wilhelm Schmidt, were executed by a U.S. military firing squad in Belgium. They had been captured during the Battle of the Ardennes as part of Operation Greif, a German operation led by Otto Skorzeny. In this operation, German soldiers donned American uniforms, infiltrated Allied lines, and attempted sabotage, including altering road signs and sowing confusion among U.S. troops. Under the laws of war, fighting in enemy uniform was considered espionage and punishable by death. Following a U.S. military court, Peris, Billing, and Schmidt were convicted and taken to the village of Henri-Chapelle. That winter morning, they were tied to posts, blindfolded, and forced to face American soldiers' rifles. The sentence was carried out with a single shot. What are your thoughts on these executions? Pietro Caruso, the former fascist police chief of Rome, faced his end on September 22, 1944, at Fort Brevetta. As he was taken from a vehicle, he hobbled forward on crutches. His limp was the result of a broken femur from a car crash during the chaotic final months of the war. Supported as he moved, he was brought to the execution chair. Caruso had been a loyal fascist and a close collaborator with the German occupiers. In March 1944, after a partisan attack killed 33 German soldiers in Rome, he helped compile the list for the Fosse Ardeatine massacre, where 335 civilians and political prisoners were executed in brutal reprisal. After the liberation of Rome, Caruso was quickly put on trial. On September 21, 1944, Italy's High Court of Justice sentenced him to death for his role in aiding and abetting these atrocities. The very next morning, he was carried to Fort Brevetta. Dr. Claus Carl Schilling was executed by hanging on May 28, 1946, at Landsberg Prison. Before the war, Schilling was a respected tropical medicine specialist at the Robert Koch Institute. But during World War II, he conducted malaria experiments at Dachau concentration camp, infecting over 1,000 prisoners. Many died, and survivors were left with grave injuries. After the war, Schilling was among the defendants at the Dachau trials. Witnesses described how he allowed mosquitoes to bite victims through cages strapped to their limbs, then injected them with experimental drugs. Hundreds perished. Despite his previous reputation, the tribunal found him guilty of war crimes. On the day he was executed, Schilling refused to appeal and even wept, pleading to finish his research. But justice was swift. He was led to the gallows, pronounced dead by hanging, closing a chapter on one of medicine's darkest betrayals. April 1944. Near Naples, Italy, Italo Palese, shirtless, defiant, cigarette aloft, stood tied to a stake, awaiting execution. He and 3 other young fascist saboteurs from the Italian Social Republic had parachuted into Allied-controlled territory. Accused of espionage and sabotage, they were sentenced to death by a U.S. military court. On that spring day, at a quarry near San Angelo in Fermiz, their final moments were framed by the grotesque iconography of resistance. Youthful courage and fanaticism transformed into a tableau of retribution. With the crack of rifles, they fell, symbols of a crushed regime. Their last stand became one of the most haunting images of Italy's brutal, fractured war years. Italo Palese's final request was simple: a last cigarette, and to face his execution without a blindfold. What would you ask for if you knew it was your final moment? Johann Victor Kirsch, an SS Untersturmführer known for his brutality, was executed by hanging at Landsberg Prison on May 28, 1946. Found guilty of war crimes by a U.S. military tribunal on November 15, 1945, Kirsch had become emblematic of the extreme violence of the SS. Witnesses reported that Kirsch showed no remorse during the trial and even displayed defiance in the face of death. His execution, captured in rare archival footage, encapsulates the post-war reckoning with Nazi officials responsible for atrocities. When the trapdoor opened, a career built on cruelty came to a definitive end. Justice delivered, and history's verdict rendered. Do you believe Johann Victor Kirsch's hanging was true justice for his war crimes? Or was it another example of post-war vengeance carried out in the name of justice?